It's a go, huh? All right. Well, tonight we are going to complete the book of Luke, going through from chapter 7 to the end. So we won't hit every chapter and every detail, but we will hit the highlights. And what I want to do again is cover things that were not covered in Matthew and Mark, or are looked at from a different angle, and are also not covered in John. And so then in John we will cover some other things. Of course, John's much easier to do because he's got a lot of unique material. And I'd like to begin tonight looking in chapter 7 and the healing of the centurion's slave, verses 2 through 10. We have an interesting situation where Jesus heals the slave of a centurion. It's interesting, again, to read the different commentaries and hear them try to relate this to the nobleman's son in John chapter 4 and various other stories, because in a lot of the approaches to the Gospels, they think that these stories were just stories floating around that the editors of these various Gospels modified for their purposes. And so you'll find in commentaries where they'll see each one of these incidences as the same. They might even see the healing of the son and the raising of Jairus' daughter and the healing of this slave as all actually the same event. So beware of that. I believe they are separate events, and they're reported separately. Now here, the centurion sends to Jesus and asks him to heal his slave. And the term for the slave there is it is a house servant, and apparently young, someone that he appreciates who is suffering. Now, what does he mean by a centurion? We normally think of a centurion as a Roman soldier, but the Romans had legions that were composed of Romans, and then they had legions that were composed of people from other countries. They were auxiliary troops, as they called them. They had the same titles, and they had the same structure. They would be commanded by a Roman, but all the people underneath, especially the enlisted personnel, would not be Romans. They would be from some other country. Now, if they were a centurion, though, they would be very well paid. Centurions were paid several times over what a regular troop was, and a centurion was over 100 men. And the way they did their legions is they worked in groups of 100. You had 100 men under a centurion, and then you would have 600 men, or there would be 6 of these units would make a cohort, and then the 10 cohorts would make a legion. So a legion was 6,000 soldiers. And a centurion got to be a centurion by being the biggest, baddest guy in his unit. And if he proved himself a worthy soldier, he would eventually be promoted to centurion. And they actually had 3 different levels of centurions. You had your initial centurion, who would be paid one level, and then out of these centurions, because in this legion then, how many centurions are you going to have? You're going to have about 60 of them. Amongst these centurions then, there was a second level, you could get promoted, I guess you'd say, of senior centurions. And out of that group, about 15 senior centurions, they would select the top centurion. And he would be paid fabulously. And it was a very powerful person. All of them were, compared to regular people, they were very wealthy. Now, what the Romans did is, if you served faithfully in the military, and of those who enlisted in the military, about 50% lived long enough to retire. And if you served for 20 years, you got to retire, much like our military system. And so about 50% of the men would retire. And when they retired, they got a special retirement bonus, which included Roman citizenship. So it paid to be a soldier, even in one of these auxiliary units. And a centurion, he made enough money, he could actually buy his citizenship if he wanted to, even sooner. Remember the centurion who arrested Paul? You know, when Paul said he was a Roman citizen, he said, I bought my citizenship. And Paul said, I was born a citizen. And all the guys touching him jumped back because they weren't citizens. What happens to them for messing with a Roman citizen? they get executed. And it's a very serious thing because Roman citizens had distinct rights. So this centurion is probably an Arab. He's not an Italian, even though he's called a centurion. He's from that area, probably from Syria, in fact, because the Romans had a legion that was made up from that region. Not from Palestine itself, not from Israel itself or Judah, but from Syria and some of those other areas. And these guys would be attached down there or assigned to different areas. And another possibility is this guy may have actually even been a retired centurion because of where he's located. It could work either way. So he wouldn't especially be a Roman, but he would be within the Roman military system. Interestingly enough, when you retired as one of these senior centurions, the pay was equivalent to like over $1 million. I mean, you retired a millionaire, a multimillionaire, if you retired as a senior centurion.
Who was the person, or what was the group of people that brought them to promotion?
The officers over them. So, and those would be nobles from Roman nobility. Because this legion would be commanded by someone from the Roman aristocracy who would come and command it. And so he would be promoting these guys.
Was it based on merit, or was it part of the Good Old Boys Club?
Most likely, because these guys were coming from the lower classes, it was more based on merit. It would, my guess be that would explain why the Roman legions were so good, were so powerful. Even when Rome fell to the barbarians, Roman legions still won their battles. Just Rome crumbled from within. But they were very efficient. And to be a centurion, you had to really be good. It wasn't one of these things where they promoted you because you're so-and-so's cousin. Because, see, if you're anybody that the leadership would show any favoritism to, you're an officer because you're coming from the nobility. If you're not from the nobility or the aristocracy, the upper class, then you don't get to be an officer. It's very rare that someone who became a centurion would eventually become an officer. It happened on rare occasions, but usually not. Usually centurion is about as high as you're going to be able to get. So this guy is wealthy. He's wealthy. But he's also not a Jew. He's not a Jew, but he is a God-fearer. Now, when he approaches Jesus, we're familiar with the story. He sends a message to Jesus and says, "Please don't come under my roof." Why does he tell Jesus not to come under his roof? Yeah, the centurion's not a Jew, and he knows that Jews do not go into Gentiles' homes. Now, he's a powerful enough person that he can make Jesus come in. In fact, his request is really a command. I mean, it reaches that level. Now, but he comes and says, I'm a man under authority, and I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. Now, there he is really saying, I recognize who you are, and I am not worthy. So here's something that he has said that's very contrary even to the culture, because in their world, a centurion would view himself as superior to these common folks. So he says, no, I recognize who you are. I'm not worthy. And then he makes that statement about, I tell one guy to go and I have authority and I know what authority is. So I understand that you, as Messiah, can simply just give the word and it'll happen. So just do that. Now, of course, what's Jesus' response? He says, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. In fact, when you look at all the other instances, the Jews are constantly asking for signs and all this kind of stuff. Here someone says, I don't need anything, I just need your word. And an interesting thing in Luke is the pattern that the Gentiles are always outshining the Jews. They have faith. They have faith. Now we move from this, beginning of verse 11 to 17, we have the story of the widow of Nain, where Jesus is going through a village, Nain. It's near Cana. Okay, it's near Cana where he done his miracles. He made the water into wine. It's right down there in the same area of the Jezreel Valley. And he's walking through town and he sees as the story goes, he sees them bringing the guy out. Now that means the young man died that day, because their rule was they bury you the day you die. And most likely they're taking them to a dirt grave. They had two kinds of graves. If you were poor, they buried you like we bury people, in the ground. If you were wealthy, you owned a cave or dug out a tomb, and you would be buried in the tomb. But it would be a family tomb or a family cave, and that once you'd all decayed away and nothing was left but bones, they would come in, gather up your bones, put them in a bone box, what they call an ossuary, and store it that way. Or prior to the use of ossuaries, they would have usually a receptacle in the grave, a big hole, and they would gather your bones and stick them in there, just like in the Old Testament times. You would be gathered to your fathers. That's what it meant. All your bones got gathered up and tossed in the hole with everybody else. And so they're carrying him to bury him. He has died. Now, why does Jesus raise him from the dead? Because Jesus just happens to be passing by. And he just happens to see them hauling this guy off to bury him. And I'm sure he's seen a lot of other people buried. Now, he does raise Lazarus because he loves Lazarus. So he goes and raises him from the dead in John chapter 11. But why does he raise this guy? Because this tells us something about Jesus' personality and character. Because he's a widow's son, her only son, so that means he's poor.
Well, the whole theme, it seems like of Luke, is the poor, Jesus' compassion on those who seem to have great need, like the poor.
That's right. In fact, here you have a widow whose only son has died. What does that mean for her? No support. And I think, it's the compassion of Jesus for the widow that motivates him to raise the son. And in compassion, he gives him life for the benefit of his mother. That's the neat thing about the way God still works. He cares about widows and orphans and helpless people. And I think I've told in here the story about the widow that I knew, right? The little old lady that God would just answer her prayers in amazing ways. Why? Because he cares. And he is still actively involved in taking care of widows and orphans. And so Jesus responds to that. Now later on in chapter 7, we have the situation of an immoral woman washing Jesus' feet. At the end of the chapter, we have this situation beginning in verse 36. He is invited to a Pharisee's house. And remember, the Pharisees now, they are sticklers for righteous living and for obeying the law and all that kind of good stuff. And so he comes and he eats, and he's eating, and we're told a woman in the city who was a sinner. Now that doesn't mean especially that she was a prostitute, though a lot of people like to say that. But it does mean that in some way she was a wicked woman. She wasn't living up to Pharisaical standards, because the term sinner doesn't always mean what we would think of as wicked. Sinners, the Pharisees referred to people as sinners who didn't wash their hands before meals, who didn't do all the ceremonial things, who didn't go to the temple at the right time, who didn't obey all their rules. So they called them publicans and sinners. And so a publican, of course, would be a tax collector, and they just lumped them right there with the tax collectors, but they just called them sinners. And they looked down their noses at them as second-class citizens. That's their attitude. Well, she comes, and apparently she has lived a sinful life. She brings an alabaster flask of fragrant oil, and the indication is this would be very expensive, stood at his feet behind him. Now, how can she stand at Jesus' feet behind him? What position is Jesus in? He's reclining. The way they did meals at that time, and this was the Roman influence, and this is the way it'll be in the upper room when they have their meal, is they ate around what's called a triclinium. And a triclinium, three tables, be set up just like ours in a horseshoe shape, and the people would be laying on couches on their left elbow, because you eat with your right, and they'd be on their left elbow, able to reach the food, and their feet are sticking out from the tables. And they did this especially for feasts or special occasions because that you ate in a relaxed manner and all that. And then the servants or whoever's serving the food brings the food into the middle to serve everybody. And at the very head of the table is where the host will sit or the guest of honor if the host isn't sitting with them all. And if the host is there, then the guest of honor is right next to him, and then the next person, and you go alternating back all the way down to the end based on who's the most honored person. And the least honored person is at the far end. And so they're there eating, and so she can be standing at Jesus' feet, and she's back away from the table itself because their feet aren't under the table. And so she anoints it, and she wipes his feet. Washes his feet with her tears and wipes them with her hair and kisses his feet and anoints him with the fragrant oil. And by the way, to wipe his feet with her hair meant she had to take her hair down. Jewish women wore their hair in a bun. And the only time a woman, a decent woman, undid her hair was in the bedroom. Only her husband's supposed to see her with her hair down. To let your hair down in public would have the same shock effect today as, let's say, baring your breasts. I mean, it would be that kind of a vulgar kind of move in people's thinking. You just didn't do it. That's the kind of thing. And so she washes, and notice the man's thought. If this man were if he were a prophet, would know who and what man or woman this is who's touching him, for she's a sinner. See, a Pharisee would never even let her touch him because she's unclean. She's not ceremonially clean. She hasn't done all the rules. They wouldn't even get close to her. Pharisees, in fact, if they saw someone that they thought was unclean, they don't even get in spitting distance. Because they might spit on them. So, they go way around and all this kind of stuff. So this is his thinking. And in this incident, we have a couple of situations that we see. First of all, Jesus answers and says, Simon, I have something to say to you. So the guy's name, Simon. Teacher, say it. And he gives a story of the creditor. Now, what's the point of the story? You've got a creditor. One has a big debt, one has a little debt. He freely forgives them both. Which of them will love him more? And, of course, Simon answers, the one forgiven the most. The one forgiven the most. Now, Jesus says, you've rightly judged this, and he turns to the woman and says to Simon, you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet. Now, what's the significance of that? Before Jesus came into Simon's house, do you know what he did? If he's going to have dinner with him? Yeah, he walked in, right? No. Actually, Jesus first went to the public bath and bathed himself to make himself presentable. Because they don't have deodorant. And they've been walking around all day. And it's hot. And he's beginning to resemble Lazarus in the grave. He stinketh. So they would bathe themselves, and then they would come to the meal. But walking there, your feet get dirty because you're wearing sandals. The streets are made out of dirt, and all the livestock go through them and leave little presents. And it all gets incorporated into the dirt and the dust, and so your feet smell like you've been walking through a barn and not paying attention to where you're stepping. And so the courteous thing for a host to do would be to either provide a bowl of water so a person can wash their own feet, or provide a servant with the water to wash their feet. And they normally pick the lowest person in the house. That's the one who has to do the job, because it was the worst possible job, the stinkiest job. And so Simon hasn't done that. What does that tell us about his attitude towards Jesus? Yeah, he doesn't really think well of him. I mean, he has very blatantly said, I don't respect you, by the way he has treated Jesus. And that's Jesus' point. He says, You gave me no water for my feet, but she washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. she soiled herself on His dirty feet in order to make them clean. There's the contrast. He says, you gave me no kiss. Again, it was customary for the host to welcome the guests with a kiss. That's how they greeted. Nowadays we shake hands. Well, some cultures shake hands. Even today, some cultures kiss, even in the United States. Depending on which ethnic group you're from, they greet with a kiss. Now, in their culture, men kiss men, women kiss women. The only time a man kissed a woman, again, is in the bedroom. You didn't do it out in public, not even to your own mate. It was scandalous. And so he says, you didn't kiss me. But she, again, has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil. Again, that was something you did for guests at a banquet. Oil was the equivalent of perfume. It was a sign of celebration. It was soothing. Anointed the head. It smooths the hair out, all that kind of stuff. Gets the dust out, whatever. It felt good. It was a nice thing. It's olive oil. And he says, you didn't anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. So the massive contrast. But here's the interpretive problem. He says, therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Okay. Obviously, Simon didn't love Jesus much because he was a righteous man. He didn't have anything to be forgiven. She, on the other hand, had great sins to be forgiven and was responding with great love. And we see that even today. I would say very often I see a greater passion for the Lord amongst people who have been saved out of difficult life, out of sin, than someone who's grown up all their lives in the church with Christ and they're just used to it. When I discipled guys in college, I found the ones who had been good, committed pagans up until they became Christians seemed to grow faster and have a greater, intense love for the Lord than kids who'd grown up in church, and I'm trying to disciple them, and everything is, oh yeah, that's interesting. And they just seem to just sort of plug along and don't seem to do a whole lot. Now, in the long run, I've seen both of them go on to serve the Lord very faithfully. But it seemed like those who grew up in the church didn't have the same level of passion. It had to grow. It took much longer to get it going. Well, that's why, I think. Because the one who knows how much they've been forgiven really do appreciate it. But here's a question. Her sins, which are many, are forgiven because she loved much. So did her love produce forgiveness of sins? Is that what Jesus is saying here?
I think this would be hard. The attitude.
Yeah. In fact, see, that's right. People misinterpret this because they get them backwards. Now, Jesus said it backwards. But loving doesn't produce forgiveness. Forgiveness produces loving. And the reason she loves much is because she was forgiven much. She didn't gain forgiveness because she loved Jesus. Otherwise, you get forgiveness by the works you do. Jesus didn't forgive her because she washed His feet. She washed His feet because He had forgiven her. See the difference? And that is a key thing. Again, God does forgive us great sins. But sometimes our lack of enthusiasm for the Lord is because we don't understand how much we're forgiven. And we should. Well, in chapter 8, I'd like to look at something beginning in verse 16 through 18. 8:16 through 18, Jesus is talking about various things. And here he says, no one, when he has lit a lamp, covers it with a vessel or puts it under a bed. Okay, but he sets it on a lampstand, that those who enter may see the light. This was, again, a classic Jewish practice. The Jews, no matter how poor they were, they had some kind of a lampstand, usually inserted into the wall of the room, the one-room house or four-room house. They'd have a lampstand there, and they would put their little oil lamp. No matter how poor you were, you could afford oil. And you could have these lamps because they did not sleep in the dark at night. They had to have light all night long. They would not sleep in the dark at night. They viewed the darkness as evil. And so the light dispels the evil. And so when he talks about this, they go, of course no one with a right mind sticks a lampstand under a bed. You put it on a lampstand so that those who enter may see the light. But now look at the application he makes. For nothing is secret that will not be revealed, nor anything hidden that will not be known and come to light. Okay, now there is, I would say, a good warning, because notice his application. Therefore, take heed how you hear in terms of listening to Jesus' teachings. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and whoever does not have, even what he seems to have will be taken from him. And this theme comes out in several other parables. You and I receive instruction from the Lord, enlightenment. But one of the warnings that he makes also is that all things about your and my lives are ultimately going to be revealed. Some Christians think, especially people who go into the ministry, they think they can lead double lives. You can't. You need to make sure you are who you are. And you need to make sure that you're dealing with sin and getting it cleaned out of the closet, because the door is going to swing open at the most inopportune time by God's design. He does not allow us to get away with secret sin. And I think that's a part of what he's talking about here. And for those who has, more will be given. For those of us who God has given great opportunity, he expects more from us. But those of us who take those opportunities to serve him, he'll give us greater and greater opportunities. That's the principle there. But we have to understand that our lives are open books. And God doesn't put us, there. I mean, he's telling us nothing that we do in secret is going to stay a secret. So how we live our lives really does matter. And I have to think about that. Even the things that I do at home, I assume my son's going to blab about it. Those of you who've had kids or have kids, you know about this, right? Yeah. That's right. That's right. They'll tell you everything.
Don't even have to ask.
That's right. And nowadays some teachers take advantage of that, and they investigate families that way. It's interesting. Our teachers, when Ian was in public school, they did that. So we asked about it. They said, "Oh no, he doesn't have anything. Everything he tells us about sounds real good." In fact, they could tell which kids had problems at home and which ones didn't just by the way they behaved. So they didn't worry about him, and they didn't know how I was working with his mind. But no, but there's a principle that he teaches here, and this was connected with the parables of the kingdom, which we didn't look at when we went through them in Matthew. But there's that principle which we need to live by, because Jesus is speaking to us about that. Now later on, he's going to raise Jairus' daughter. See, here's the funny thing: we have the centurion and we have Jairus' daughter, but sometimes people try to put them together, but they're not. In 40 to 56. Jairus calls for him. He's at least a wealthy man. He's some kind of ruler of the synagogue, at least. So that puts him at a high place in his city. In other words, he's the head guy of the synagogue. He's a very significant person. He asks Jesus to come raise his daughter. Now, in this story, we have that pause of the woman with the hemorrhage. And again, it's a very familiar story. She grabs his hem. And Jesus feels the power go out from him. Now, as a result, there are some people who sometimes feel like they can feel the power. How is it that Jesus can tell that happened? Because people are bumping into Him. And there are other times when He does it, and people could just touch the hem of His garment and be healed, just like here. Why does He heal this woman for sneaking up and grabbing the hem of His garment? Yeah, her faith. And He, as sovereign God, is omniscient. And her faith is placed in Him. And remember, it's the object of your faith that counts. She's grabbing His hem, but she believes that He can and will heal her if she succeeds. And He does. But, of course, she thought she's going to get away with it. Why does He stop and insist that she come forward and confess? This is the big interpretive question.
Was it a testimony to people around?
Was it? Because it doesn't need that. In fact, his pattern has been to try to downplay the miraculous. Remember, in Mark, he tells everyone to be quiet. Here he's surrounded by people, and he stops and makes her come. I think, for one thing, remember, her illness is not visible. She can feel the healing. Nobody else. And my own interpretation, or my own understanding is he's really doing it for her sake. She needs to hear it from him. But it's also for Jairus' sake, because it's by faith. And Jairus is about to face a major trauma. Because when they get to his house, what has happened? The daughter has died. And they come and tell him, your daughter's dead. And in fact, they're not even to the house yet. So I believe Jesus stopped and spoke to her, not for her benefit. She knew she was healed, and she was already happy. In fact, it scared her silly. She probably thought, oh no, is he going to take it away or what? Because I didn't do it according to the rules. Tells him, nope. But he goes, I think it's for Jairus' sake, because he knows he's going to be facing the news. And in fact, when they get the news, they tell him, your daughter's dead, do not trouble the teacher. And Jesus hears it, and he says, do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well. See, we got the connection right there. And he goes in the house, and he raises her from the dead. And so he has done that for Jairus' sake.
Also related to what you said before about she being a woman and also.
That's right. Yeah, she's a woman. She's poor because she spent all of her money on doctors. She's insignificant in everybody's view except Jesus's. And she matters to him. She matters to him. This is the thing, again, that comes out in Luke. All these little people matter to Jesus in a very personal way. And what is really encouraging about that to me is sometimes I struggle with the question of, where do I really fit in? God is so big, and what He's doing is so big, and I'm so insignificant in the program. I'm just a little speck in the program. What difference does it make? In fact, there are times when I struggle with the idea of should I even pray? Does God really even have time for me? I think He's busy running the universe. And after the Voyager spacecraft went through and took pictures of all those planets, I saw all the neat stuff He's doing on all them planets that we hadn't even known about. Some neat stuff. Some of the moons out there, moons are going around our planets out there. One of them has oceans of liquid nitrogen with massive storms that would dwarf anything we have on Earth. There's one that's got ice volcanoes blowing plumes of ice 150 miles up into the air. Neat stuff going on out there, and we can't even get there to see it. But, God's been watching it all this time, having a good time. And you wonder, with the universe as big as it is, and Earth itself as insignificant as it is, and God is blowing up supernovas here and swirling these things there, and you got all these neat neutron stars throwing signals in all kinds of crazy directions. There's all kinds of really wild stuff out there that's certainly far more entertaining to watch than what's going on here. And then you think there's the billions of people on Earth, and there are the big boys out there. There are the Bill Brights, the Billy Grahams, the ones who are really having the worldwide impact. And you wonder, well, what about little old me just out here in the middle of nowhere? And in case y'all didn't know it, Oregon is out in the middle of nowhere. It's way out on the west coast. It's not in Texas where everything is, right? No, but even in Texas, it'd be like being out west Texas. But sometimes you wonder, should I even pray? And the answer is, we all matter to Him. In fact, sometimes that's the only thing hindering Him using us, is the fact that we're not taking Him seriously because of our own low self-image. And we're thinking of ourselves as too insignificant. And yet, God, Jesus, in His busy schedule, took the time for little old ladies, for little girls, for widows, for insignificant people who come along, for someone whose reputation is completely in the trash can, who sneaks into a party and wipes his feet. He takes time for each of these people, and He cares about them, and He cares about us individually. And we need to meditate on that. We need to think about that, because we need to live with the reality that God does care, and what I am doing does matter. I have a role in His kingdom and in His program that He has privileged me to have. And I should be enjoying that rather than thinking, oh, I'm not worthy. I've seen a lot of people hold back from serving God because they didn't think they were worthy. And yet they've been given an opportunity. And we take those opportunities. And we see, this is God's choice of me and for me to do this. And what's neat is, I have found in my own life that every year just about, I can point to something where I was uniquely suited to meet that person's need in a way no one else could have, and that's why I was there. And that's the exciting thing, because that means God's using me. That means God's using me. He has, for example, in this case, for this new seminary project, He's brought me to this point to be able to be a part of this. Who knows? 50 years from now, it may be a major mover and shaker in the evangelical world, assuming Jesus hasn't come back. And in that case, 50 years from now, it'll be a cornfield. But in the millennial kingdom. But it can be a very exciting thing when you see that God is at work, and He works through and works to and for what we think of as insignificant people. And each one of us in this room is going to be uniquely used by God, but also we are uniquely cared for by God. But often we forget to realize that. And we have these instances. The thing that stands out about all these instances, again, is that pattern that Luke brings out, that God cares about the little people. And that's us. That's us. You don't have to be one of the big shots for God to care about you. Okay. I'd like to move now to chapter 10. We're going to jump a little ways here. In 10:17, we have the return of the 70. Now, remember, we've already looked at Jesus sending the 12 out in Matthew chapter 10. Here in Luke chapter 10, you have, in Luke, you had the sending of the 12, and then you have a sending of the 70 to do the same thing that the 12 did, to carry a message to the nation of the coming Messiah, that the kingdom of heaven is imminent. It's at hand. It can come any moment now. The thing I want to pause and look at here is, which is different from the others, is when they come back and they report, they're excited. They said, even the demons are subject to us in your name. But notice what Jesus says. He said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Look at the attitude. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that you're going to be super apostles. It says, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. What's the key there? It's perspective. We don't get excited. We shouldn't rejoice because we have some great ministry. I mean, you should, yes. If on Sunday you preach and a half a dozen people trust in Jesus, that's exciting. Right? But what is Jesus saying? You don't measure yourself. You don't measure yourself by how many people get saved. You don't measure yourself by how many people come to church. In American society, how do we measure the success of a church? If the numbers are increasing.
And as a missionary who writes support letters and stuff, if I'm not saying that 5 people every week come to know the Word and that we have, 2 more people each week attending, then people are wondering what's wrong with our ministry.
That's right.
It's a hard thing.
Yeah.
People need to come know the Lord. That's why I'm there. But at the same time, it's attention.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. It's a lot of pressure because American society thinks in those dollars and cents, numerical statistics kind of things. And there are times when you're having a very effective ministry, but nothing's happening. Some of the most effective times is when nothing apparently was happening, but God was at work. But what Jesus is saying here, these people had just experienced the ultimate success. They were casting out demons, they're raising the dead, they're healing the sick. Power is coming out of them. And they've seen the kingdom of God at work. And Jesus says, now let's get some perspective here. That's nothing in comparison to the reality that your name is written in heaven. And perspective. Jesus points to us to keep perspective. And whenever God uses me, I shouldn't be focused on what I've done, but where I'm going. And the reason I do it is because of where I'm going. Our eyes have to be on the right objective, because that keeps our perspective right. Because what happens, in fact, to people who begin to measure themselves by their successes? They either get all stressed out when things don't go well and God doesn't bless, or they begin an ego trip. I'm it because of my success. I'm the pastor of the biggest church. I have the largest women's ministry. I have seen this many people come to the Lord. And I've seen people like that. They can tell you, how many people I've led to the Lord this week and this year and all this kind of stuff. And it's a big deal. But no, that's not near as important as the reality that they're going to get to spend eternity in heaven with God. And that's where they ought to be meditating to be motivated. What needs to motivate each of us is our relationship to God and our future destiny and the reality of all those blessings, not the nuts and bolts things of today, even when God's blessing them.
Is that principle related to the simple woman being forgiven?
Yeah. Because her perspective was she was appreciating her forgiveness, and that's what made her happy. We should be doing the same thing. I have found that it really helps me a lot when I do stop to remember that I have been saved by grace. And that even though I was saved as a 6-year-old kid, I spent most of my life as a Christian. I've lived a good life. I've been a good boy, other than when I drove my mother nuts. But I haven't, I've lived a rather boring life. It doesn't make for a great testimony. You know, I saved as a kid. I obeyed my mother. You know, I went to school, graduated. You know, okay, that's exciting. You know, not much happened. But what really does help me is to stop and realize that, no, I have sinned against God regularly, and I have been forgiven, and I experienced that forgiveness. And because of that forgiveness, I have a destiny. And no matter how bad things get at times, no matter whatever happens, I know where I'm going, and I know that my reward is with me. You know, it's an interesting thing. A couple of years ago, I had a heart attack. And I was laying in the hospital, and they'd done a angiogram. And while they're doing the angiogram, if you're not familiar with it, you know, they run the tube up your, you know, they go on an artery in your leg, and they go on up and put the tube up into your heart, and they spray dye in and take x-rays, and they go, oh yeah, there's the block spot. I had 100% blockage. And you could watch the dye come in and stop at the blockage, and then go around the other arteries and back up from the back, because they had joined together. And so I was backfilling my heart, which is great, because that's why I ended up with no heart damage. But so we did that, and so they said, well, you know, we'll put the stent in and everything will be fine. By the way, this will be a little bit uncomfortable. Translated, that means I thought I was having another heart attack, because now the blood's going the right direction, and the heart thinks it's going the wrong direction, and it sends out all these signals saying something's gone wrong. But meanwhile, I kept telling them, my stomach hurts. They go, well, that's weird. You shouldn't be feeling anything. No, but my stomach hurts. You know, I can't understand why. They didn't figure out what was wrong until my blood pressure was about 50/30. Okay, if any of you are familiar with medical stuff, that means you're about 3 or 4 heartbeats from being flatlined. And they realized I was leaking. And the reason my stomach was hurting is because when they had inserted the tube, the needle had poked through the artery, and it was leaking down below, which is not a problem normally, but I had a couple of hernia operations. So where you normally have this wall across your leg, and when this happens, the leg swells up with blood, and they see it, and they know how to fix it right then. Mine's just draining into my belly the whole time, and basically I'd run out of oil. They, again, for those of you who might be familiar with medical stuff, in the next 10 minutes or so, after they figured out what was wrong, they squeezed 6 liters of saline solution into me to try to get my blood pressure back up. You know, you got the 4 doctors standing on each side, just like in the TV shows. And they're giving the orders and doing all these things and calling up the units of blood and kicking my wife out, which was very traumatic for her, because she realized something's bad. But, you know, at that point I realized I may not make it. And I had to stop and say, now, how am I going to approach this? And the neat thing is, when I had come to Salem out of seminary, my prayer had been, I'd been in the doctoral program, and I'd been in school forever. And my prayer was, Lord, let me live at least 2 years so that I can at least, all the studying I've done, get some kind of use out of it. Well, at that point, it was 10 years after I'd gotten here. And I thought, well, you know, I'd like to have 10 more years, but if I don't get them, hey, I got 5 times as much as I asked for. And I can now, if I don't make it, I can look forward to heaven. And that helped me handle it. Now, it didn't help my wife any. I mean, she thinks, you know, he's turned white as a sheet. He's cold and clammy, and they're still trying to squeeze more water into him. Yeah, and but having the right perspective helped me handle it. I wasn't alarmed by the whole thing. Everybody else was. That's where our perspective is supposed to be. Our perspective has to be, again, on what really matters is our destiny, not our performance. Same thing here. Doesn't matter what grades you make. Doesn't matter those things. Your destiny is far more important. That's where your happiness should be built. And that is what Jesus taught. Okay, I'd like to, here in chapter 10, again, look at another incident, the story of the Good Samaritan. And again, a very familiar one, and it's in Luke, the parable of the Good Samaritan, We're told a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And again, you know my view on that. What he's really talking about is being qualified to enter the kingdom. Because again, what does Jesus ask him? What is written in the law? What is your reading of it? And again, some interpreters take it to mean that people were saved under the Old Testament economy by their works. And they're saved in the New Testament economy by faith. They made a distinction between faith and works. Martin Luther had this idea. The Old Testament was of law versus grace, or law versus works versus grace, faith. There was those distinctions. But as I see it, you're saved the same way from Adam on, by faith. That's how Abraham was saved. And Paul, in fact, uses Abraham as the model. Again, Romans chapter 4 and other places. And so here, he's not talking about how to be justified, but he is talking about something else. But he says, what's written, what you're reading. And he answers, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Now, these are not 10 commandments, but these are commandments in the Mosaic Law that the Jews understood as summarizing everything in the law. Your love for God, your love for others, and all the laws connected to it. And Jesus says, you answer rightly. Do this, and you will live. Notice the promise there? You will live. There again, I think he's talking about you will survive the day of the Lord. And so he wants to justify him and says, who is my neighbor? Now, why does he do the story of the Samaritan? What are you familiar with in these groups? You got the priest and the Levite, and then you got the Samaritan, and you got the guy who's beat up. Why won't the priest or the Levite help the guy?
Well, Samaritans and Jews didn't have to.
Right, but the guy who's beat up is a Jew.
I'm sorry, that's right.
Yeah.
Too busy, probably preoccupied with religion.
Okay.
They were contaminated themselves.
That's right. They become ceremonially unclean. If you touch blood, you become unclean. And this guy, he's been beaten up. He's bleeding all over the place. He's stripped. He's probably naked, or mostly naked. They can't help him without soiling themselves. And in fact, notice he talks about how they walked on the other side. They're not going to get anywhere close to him that they might accidentally get something on him. Now, in the law, you are, if you're an Israelite, any other Israelite is your brother or your neighbor. So when you love your neighbor as yourself, it's the idea that they viewed all other Israelites, all other Jews are their brothers and their neighbors. There's a family connection. And the point here is these guys won't even help family. I mean, that's what it is. And of course, the Samaritan does help them. And Jesus and asks them, who was the real neighbor? And of course, he has to say it's the Samaritans. And Jesus tells them, go and do likewise. See, here's someone who probably, again, being a lawyer, that means he's a scribe, that means he's in the religious system. That means if he was to face that same situation, he too would walk around. Because his holiness is more important than that person's life. That's the mindset. But Jesus tells them real righteousness, the kind that God approves of, does something. And again, notice, it helps the poor, helpless person. James put it this way. What is true religion? Two things, huh? Helping widows and orphans in their distress, and keeping oneself unstained by the world. Those are the two aspects of what God considers true religious duty, true religious service to Him. If we want to serve Him, number one, we help the helpless. We help the people who need help. Maybe we should put it that way, because they're not always helpless, but they need help. whether it's they're in need of counseling, whether it's that they're in need of food. You know, the Habitat for Humanity comes out of the social gospel age, but they are doing something very practical to help people who need help. Interestingly enough, some of our students at Western Baptist were involved in the project here in this area. And one of the things that they learned is that Habitat for Humanity, their first choice is to build homes for known Christians, because they're helping the body of Christ that's in need, which again is a very biblical principle. We help the family first and then the world. And so that's a good thing to hear, because they build like in other countries, they build here in the United States, they build all over the world now. But it's a very practical help. Many of the food kitchens out here are actually operated by who? Either churches or Christians. Why? Because we are called to do that. In fact, it was a very interesting thing. I don't know if it's still this way now, but in the 70s and 80s, when you had a lot of these things going on, it was very interesting to find that all these different shelters and stuff was administered by a theological, philosophical liberal who sat in the office and got credit for everything that was going on and never lifted a finger. And inside that organization, everybody else would be evangelical Christians serving the soup line and doing all the dirty work, but getting none of the recognition, which is fine because they'll get the recognition from God. But the real principle here, again, is that we do it for our neighbor, and that neighbor is whoever has the need. And that is what pleases God. That's what true religion is all about. Practical stuff, not theoretical. It's not how many Bible verses we can quote. It's what we're doing in practical ways. And sometimes that means personal sacrifice. And sometimes it's very inconvenient. For me, sometimes it means sitting and talking to students at a time when I would really rather be doing research. Like right now, ETS meetings are coming up. I got a paper to do. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons are my research days. Well, today I had some students who needed to come see me and ask me some questions. So I had to stop what I was doing and meet their needs. And for me, that's a break in concentration. I may or may not get back on track again. I'm one of these that I need blocks of time to be able to function. And but they're important. They're important, and their questions and their needs are important. And that's what Jesus was talking about here. If you really love your neighbor, you do what meets their needs.
It's really hard, now that I know the Hispanic culture and the Anglo and the mindset of this culture.
Anglo culture is very different, isn't it?
Yeah, they are going by the appointment, they go by the book.
Yeah.
And if it isn't, a meeting, there is no gain,
That's right.
Or, things like that. And I think it's tough, it's hard to get used to, what you are saying about being practical.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, for the Anglo culture, very often it's difficult to be practical. Now, again, in the Hispanic culture, you care more about people. You just, okay, let's drop that and let's go take care of this. Yeah. And I've seen that's true of many other non-Anglo cultures. I would say non-obsessive cultures. Like in the Arab world, again, the same thing. Someone comes to you for help, you drop whatever you're doing and you take care of them. Hospitality is very important in much of the world. And caring for people. People is very important in much of the world. Yeah, our schedule is very important in the Anglo world. And that's where this is probably more of a challenge for us than it is for the Hispanic community in terms of taking care of one another. Yeah, that's right. That's true, yeah. Okay. Why don't we take a pause here? let's take about 10 minutes off, and then we'll continue on at about 10 after. So how much time do we have left on the tape there? Okay, plenty of time then. Oh yeah, a reminder to everybody, by the way, is this Saturday the library is being moved to our new offices, house, library, or whatever. It's I don't know if y'all know, but we have a house here in downtown now, and Carl's fixing it up. It's actually his house. Yeah, Carl and Jerry. Yeah, they're both fixing it up. And so it'll house the library, the offices, and the reception area and things like that. So this Saturday morning, it's a book moving time. Dr. House is going to get a U-Haul and load it up.
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock? Oh, in the afternoon then. Saturday afternoon. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. It'll be after that class is done, and everyone needs to get some exercise.
You and I could smile, but we weren't in that.
What's the details, like where when?
It'll be loaded up, I guess, at 3 o'clock then, and then hauled out here and unloaded.
In 2 hours.
Yeah, no more than 2 hours to get it done. So from, I guess, 3 to 5 is the plan then, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're loading it at Silverton and then unloading it here on, where's the... Madison and, 940 Madison.
And you can have the alley between Jefferson and Madison.
Yeah. And so that'll be exciting. Y'all got the lights in today, right? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's great. So that's exciting. Well, let's continue on. And turn to chapter 12, verse 35. Now, the background of this is Jesus has told a parable. He's dealing with their need to confess Him before men. He says in verse 8 of chapter 12, "Whoever confesses me before men, him the Son of Man will confess before the angels of God. But he who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God." And so he says, you're going to face persecution. But if you confess me before men in the face of persecution, you'll be recognized in heaven for it. And he's going to start talking about rewards and things here. He tells the parable of the rich fool when someone comes and asks him to judge between them and dividing the things. And he tells them about the rich fool who expands his barns to hoard everything, and then God says, you fool, you die and you don't get any of it. And then he tells them, don't worry about your material needs. The place where I want to pause and look is beginning in verse 35, where he's told them that God's going to take care of you. But then he talks about being faithful to God. He says, let your waist be girded and your lamps burning, and you yourselves be like men who wait for their master, when he will return from the wedding, that when he comes and knocks, they may open to him immediately. Now, what he's talking about here is the way their houses were designed. In fact, in the Middle East, it's still that way. You don't have doorknobs. On the outside of the house, it's a flat wall. I mean, the door doesn't have a doorknob. You got to have somebody inside who will let you in. In fact, they'll have a gatekeeper in many of the cases. Where we lived in a house there, we actually had a gatekeeper who guarded the gate. And our door to our house then, there was actually two homes, one on top and one on bottom. We lived on the bottom floor. Our front door, all it had was a metal plate and a keyhole. So if you didn't have a key, you didn't open the door. And so we had someone actually guarding the entrance to it, and then you could get in. And that's where they were. And so they would bar. In those days, remember, your home, you made it look as ugly as you could on the outside and as formidable as you could, because it was a fortress. They were built out of stone walls, and the door was a barricade to keep the thieves out. And you barricaded yourself in at night. And they didn't have nice windows like we have. They just had little openings to let the air through. and it was very dark. That's why you had to have lamps, even during the daytime in the house. There wasn't any light. And it also, though, it had the advantage, it kept them cool during the day because there was thick walls and a thick roof over it. So it would cool off at night, and then it would stay cool for most of the day. And it'd get warm enough that it would keep you warm at night, because over there, it's sort of like here, where it can be quite warm during the day, it gets real chilly at night, same thing there. And so it had that advantage. But, so when the master goes off, he leaves his servants inside the barricade, basically. I mean, someone's got to be inside to lock things, because they didn't have a key you could unlock. You had to have somebody inside guarding the place whenever you left. And so he told them, they're supposed to be ready. He says, blessed are those servants whom the master, when he comes, will find watching. Assuredly I say to you that he will gird himself and have them sit down to eat, and will come and serve them. And if he should come in the second watch, okay, they divided the night into 4 watches. So the second watch is going to be, what, about 9 to 12. Okay? Or come in the third watch, 12 to 3, or find them so. Blessed are those servants. Okay, so if whatever time of night he shows up, and remember what's going to be, the reason he's showing up at that time at night is because he doesn't want to have to stay at a hotel. So he's trying to get home as quick as he can. So he's taking a risk getting there, because you don't travel at night if you can avoid it. And then you certainly don't want to be left outside banging on the door for very long once you get there. You want to be let in immediately. It's a security issue. Safety. So he said, blessed are those servants when he finds them ready for him. But know this, if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So Jesus warns, and I believe, again, he's really speaking to the nation of Israel. And you better be ready, I'm coming back. But the same is true for us today. We have to be ready for the return of Jesus. We talk about how the rapture of the church can happen any moment. But if we really believe that, it changes the way we live our lives. Because one of the things we're not going to do is waste our time in sin. Because I don't know about you, but the last thing I want to have happen is the trumpet sound and Jesus be here while I'm in the middle of some sin. Because then what do you get to do? The very first thing you get to do with Jesus is get your chewing out. Now, I want to be serving the Lord when that happens, or whenever I happen to die. I would rather be in the midst of serving the Lord. I think of one of the guys who was my classmate who took a church up in Seattle and was having a really good, solid, healthy, successful ministry serving the Lord. Died suddenly of a massive heart attack playing racquetball with one of the men he was discipling. I mean, it was an activity that was a part of the discipleship process. So he's in the middle of helping someone grow in the Lord and gets snatched to heaven. Big surprise. He was one of those guys that didn't ever, he was a healthy guy. They had no clue. He just died suddenly. But he died in the midst of serving the Lord. And I think for him to be welcomed into heaven in the midst of serving the Lord is a good thing. He probably didn't mind. His wife wasn't very happy about it, but he probably didn't mind. So that's what Jesus is talking about. We have to be ready for His return. We have to be serving. And so Peter says to him, Lord, do you speak this parable only to us or to all people? And so Jesus then brings it even further home. He says, who then is that faithful and wise steward? Now, a steward was a servant who was appointed over other servants. That's what he was. So he would be the head servant in the house, the steward. So it says, who is that faithful steward whom his master will make ruler over his household, to give them their portion of food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. So now notice, now it's been changed. It's not just watching the door. It's taking care of the others in the master's household. See? And he says, when he finds them doing his job like the master wanted him to, and everybody's taken care of, he'll be blessed. truly I say to you, that He will make him ruler over all that he has. But if that servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants, and to eat and drink and be drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour when he is not aware, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the unbelievers. And that servant who knew his master's will and did not prepare himself to do according to his will shall be beaten with many stripes. But he who did not know yet committed these things, deserving a stripe, shall be beaten with few. For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required. And to whom much has been committed of him, they will ask the more. Now, this is a very insightful parable that tells us a great deal. One of the things that I get from it is you notice there's degrees of punishment for the unfaithful servants. What determined who gets punished the most and who gets punished the least? Obedience of what God's given you to do, but there was something else there. How much you knew. Notice he says the one who knows the master's will and doesn't do it gets lots of stripes. The one who didn't know the master's will and didn't do it, still going to be punished for not doing the master's will, but not with near as many stripes. James put it this way, let not many of you become teachers, because we incur a stricter judgment. The thing that really has hit me with this parable is the more I study the Scriptures, the more responsible God holds me. Yeah, that's quite while we're ahead. And but you know what keeps me going? This is what God has called me to. So if I goof off and I say I'm not going to study the Bible anymore, so that I don't get any more condemnation, well, that's already too late. I already know too much. Might as well just keep going. But the thing is there is accountability before God based upon what we know. And that answers the question, what do you do with a baby Christian who doesn't know a whole lot? Well, understand, God understands that. He's patient with those who don't know. We should be too. But we want to bring them, because what's the difference between the one who doesn't know a whole lot and the one who does? Time, yes. How about in the relationship with God? God's expectations changes. But also, what they can do changes. The more we know, the more God expects to use us. Notice now? Not we expect to be used by God, but God expects to use us. And you say, yeah, but I'm not brilliant. So? Neither were the apostles. You say, but I'm not gifted. So, God will still use you. The more He gives us, the more He expects from us. And one of the things that this brings out too is there are degrees of punishment. Because He's talking about cutting them in half and assigning them a place with the sinners. He's talking about, in some cases, sending someone to hell. And from this parable, we often take the idea that in hell there will be degrees of punishment. We're told at the Great White Throne Judgment, when Jesus judges the wicked, He will judge them on the basis of their deeds. And He will punish them accordingly. And so there's degrees of knowledge, and as a result, degrees of accountability before God. And we who have been given so much, even before you started taking classes, the fact that you own a Bible and can read it makes you more accountable before God than 95% of the human population. Or even more than that. Because only about 5% are even Christians. So 99% or 99.9% makes you more accountable for how you live out your life. And what is He telling us here? We don't know when He's coming back. But we're accountable.
There's not an incentive to get charged up off of that. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. Well, it drives me. It keeps me going. It keeps me going. Because we need to stay alert. And again, that is a reason to guard myself from sin. That's also a reason to make sure that when God gives me opportunities to serve Him, that I take them. Again, that's within balance. You can't take every opportunity. You'll wear yourself out. Yeah. Be careful about not doing too much. You have to work within your limits. Like one of the things I've learned since my heart attack, I can only do so much. And sometimes I have to choose between this good thing and this good thing. And which one will I do? And sometimes I have to say no when I see a very real need. But if I'm going to make the long haul, I can't meet every need. I have to select the ones that I can help and the things that I can do. And so, in fact, there are times when I'm really pressed that I have to turn down a lot of different things. And there are other times when I can take on more responsibility. You know, one of the things for teaching in this class, one of the things that my wife and I did was we sat down and we said, okay, if I add that, what will I take away? I resigned as division chair at my school because that relieved me of a great deal of responsibility and pressure that enabled me to do this, and therefore it balanced things out, and I could handle it. I couldn't just add this on top of everything else. And you'll find that to be true. As God uses you, there's more and more opportunities come, and if you're not careful, you overload yourself. But at the same time, we're still supposed to be busy about serving the Lord and being used by Him because He has expectations for us. He has given us these abilities, and He expects us to produce. And so, as we're faithfully serving Him, what will happen is, one day we'll be called to account. You know, whether we get hit by a passing truck, or have a heart attack, or Jesus comes back, or we just get old and decrepit and catch pneumonia and die. You know, at some point we will give an account, and He will, and the wise steward, and we're all stewards. You know, we're not just grunts now. We're all stewards in some form or fashion of God's program. He has given us these responsibilities in the body of Christ. And they may not look significant. It's a little group here or a little thing there or, you know, this or that. Whatever it is, it's the stewardship He's given us. And what He's looking for is for us to be faithful. And therein comes the blessing. Okay, I'd like to turn to chapter 13. And in chapter 13 it begins where some people come and tell Him about some Galileans, and it says, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Now that's a strange statement, isn't it? Well, what we know from history is what happened here is these Galileans had gathered for some kind of event. There's some theories that it was a group that had gathered out in the wilderness to do some kind of special gathering and go do sacrifices and all that kind of stuff. But they were coming to Jerusalem with their sacrifices. And Pilate, for his apparent cowardice when Jesus was crucified, he was known for as being a pretty brutal guy. Again, if you know how the Roman system worked, he was a part of the upper class in Roman society. Not the very top group, but the group just below trying to get up into the top. And he'd been appointed, and being appointed, he was appointed by a guy named Sejanus, who was a general, who eventually tried to become Caesar and lost. So he had to drink a little hemlock. And most of his friends got to drink a little hemlock. You know, the way they did it is if you lost, they came to you and you said, you know, tomorrow we're going to arrest you and put you on trial. And then we will convict you. And we will take all your property from you and sell your wife and kids into slavery. But if you happen to have died during the night, we will drop all charges. And your wife and kids will inherit your estate. What a deal. And so naturally they would take a drink. Now, Pilate was helped to get to this position at the time when Sejanus was a general and wasn't trying to take over. Later on, he tries and fails, and then that's why Pilate, when Jesus is brought to him, is so wishy-washy. And that's what it means when they say, if you don't crucify him, you are no friend of Caesar. That was a very thinly veiled threat, saying, we will send a report to Rome saying, you did not execute a guy who was claiming to be a king in opposition to Caesar. Now you see the threat, because he was Sejanus' friend. Probably the reason he got left, my own guess, and a lot of historians may not agree with me, I think the reason he didn't get killed off in the purge is no one wanted his job. And so, Caesar couldn't replace him, so he just left them there. That was punishment enough. But a few years later, he did. He got exiled. He got exiled. But he was known for doing some pretty brutal things to the Jews. Like at one point, he tried to bring in Roman standards into the city of Jerusalem. Their staffs with their eagles and stuff on it. And the Jews, just marched up and refused to let them in. And so he told his soldiers, basically, draw your swords. And the Jews said, stick us. And they just laid down and said, kill us. We ain't moving. And he thought about it. He says, okay, you win. And he backed off. But he was also very quick, if he suspected anything, to squash it. So you get a group of this, several thousand people getting together. Their actual intention was to go to Jerusalem and do sacrifices. His informants tell him, we got this group gathering out there. And so he just simply grabbed his troops, said, take them out. And they just went in and killed them all. Better safe than sorry. That's how the Romans kept revolts down. And so that's the background of what happened with the Galileans who died. And then he talks about the people who the tower fell on. And well, they were building a defensive tower in Jerusalem, on the wall of Jerusalem. And they did some engineering mistake, and it came undone on the bottom, and the whole tower fell on them, and basically the rocks fell and crushed some people.
Is that recorded in some historical archive?
No, not that I know of. So, it'd be no big deal. They had these kind of accidents regularly, I'm sure. Because they're building these things by stacking these rocks on each other. And so these are defensive towers that they would be building. So you had that. It failed and killed him. But he asked the question, were the Galileans worse sinners than all Galileans because they suffered such things? And these people, do you think they were worse sinners than all other men who dwelt in Jerusalem? He says, I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Now remember, he's talking to people who have come and told him about the Galileans who've just been killed by Pilate. So he's talking to the nation of Israel. And he says, y'all aren't any worse sinners than them, and they're not any worse sinners than you. But unless you repent, remember that's been his message. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is imminent. It's at hand. It's about to come. Repent. He says, unless you repent, you're going to perish likewise. Why? Because remember, in the day of the Lord, the wicked in the nation will be purged by God. So unless a person repents, they will not survive the day of the Lord. And so he warns them of that. And that's the context then of the parable of the barren fig tree, which is what I'd like to look at here. He says, a certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. Then he said to the keeper of his vineyard, look, for 3 years I've come seeking fruit on this fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground? But he answered and said to him, Sir, let it alone this year also until I dig around it and fertilize it. And if it bears fruit, well, but if not, after that you can cut it down. Now, if you know anything about fig trees, fig tree, you can just basically take a stick from a fig tree and stick it in the ground. It'll root, and within a couple of years, it'll be making figs. Unless it freezes down to the ground, it'll make figs. And we lived in in southeast Texas where our fig tree would get frozen down to the ground. So the next year you don't get any because it has to grow back up. But if it doesn't freeze down to the ground, you're going to get figs. Them things, they just crank them out. So for it not to make figs is unusual. But what is the point of it? Well, remember, He's just said, if you don't repent, you'll be punished by God. And so what He's now saying to the nation is, if this generation doesn't produce fruit, God's done with it. Now, what happened to that generation? They didn't produce fruit. And they were wiped out by the Romans in 70 A.D. Actually, 66 to 73 A.D. God punished them and destroyed them because they did not produce the fruits of repentance, which would be belief in Jesus. And so they didn't heed His warning. Now where I'd like to move to is chapter 14. The parable of the Great Supper. It says, verse 15 of chapter 14. Now, when one of those who sat at the table with him, he's at a banquet, and he's just told them about, again, they have the triclinium, and he saw people trying to get the good seats, and he tells them, what you should do is when you go, sit at the last seat, and then the host will come and go, what are you doing down there? And he'll make somebody up front get up and go down to the last seat and let you sit in the front. He'll move you to the appropriate spot. And so the people who are grabbing for recognition, of course, get bounced. Those who humble themselves get exalted. And that's the principle that he teaches. By the way, that comes out of the book of Proverbs. This principle is taught in the book of Proverbs. And so then, in that context, then he says, now, when one of those who sat at the table with him heard these things, he said to him, blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. Again, notice they're looking forward to Messiah's reign. And so he's now going to talk about getting into the kingdom of God. That's what he's talking about here. He says, there a certain man gave a great supper and invited many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to those who were invited, come, for all things are now ready. But they all with one accord began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must go and see it. I ask you to have me excused. Oh, that's nice, okay. Another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I am going to test them. I ask you to have me excused. Now remember, these suppers, these wedding suppers especially, okay, these suppers aren't just one day especially. They may last for several days. They're significant. But in no cases do you have to go check out the field or test out the oxen. I mean, you think about it, those are wimpy excuses. And still another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. All right, blame your wife. Yeah, my wife won't let me. And now, did any of you guys ever go to your wife and say, now, wife, I'm going to ask you something, and you're supposed to say no?
Never done that.
No? Has your wives ever done that for you? Have you guys ever done that? Yeah, the kids have. Yeah. Now, my sister used to do that. When I was in college and my sister was there with me, I was a senior, she was a freshman. She didn't have the heart to tell guys no when they wanted to ask her out on a date. And there were some guys who, she considered creepy, and she wanted to run them off. So we came up with a scheme. She would tell me, or she'd tell them, you have to talk to my big brother first before I can go out with you. And then she'd tell me, run this guy off. So this guy, usually some freshman, comes to see this big senior who's a senior in the ROTC program, in uniform and all that kind of stuff. Intimidate him as much as you can. And I would talk to him for like 45 minutes or an hour. grill them. And then afterwards say, I'm sorry, but you can't go out with my sister. And so she didn't get the blame. And so anyhow, making excuses. So they're making excuses. I married a wife. I cannot come. Blame it on the wife. When in reality, again, he just doesn't want to go. It says, so the servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city and bring in here the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind. And the servant said, Master, it is done as you commanded, and still there is room. Then the master said to the servant, go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say to you that none of those men who are invited shall taste my supper. Now, interpreters discuss the significance of going out first into the streets and bringing in the lame and the blind and all that. And they would see that as the gospel being sent from the intelligentsia of Israel now to the common people, the ones who are viewed as unclean. And then the idea of going on out into the highways and hedges was the invitation of the Gentiles. Because a feast was a symbol of the kingdom. In Old Testament prophecy, the Messianic kingdom is always symbolized as a wedding feast. So here, the idea of throwing a feast is the idea, again, of getting into the kingdom. And need to pause? Okay, let's pause.